Claire and Daniel Foster were the picture-perfect couple in the eyes of their friends and neighbors. Married for nearly 10 years, they lived in a charming Victorian home in the small, picturesque town of Millfield, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Claire, 38, was a beloved kindergarten teacher, known for her warmth, patience, and infectious smile. She loved working with children and was adored by her students and their parents alike. Daniel, at 42, was a charismatic entrepreneur with a golden touch. His ventures always seemed to succeed, whether it was real estate, tech startups, or his most recent venture, an exclusive men's luxury goods brand. To the outside world, they were a power couple who had it all: a successful business, a beautiful home, and a seemingly loving marriage. But beneath the surface, there were cracks in the foundation that Claire had long chosen to ignore. Daniel had become increasingly secretive in recent years, often claiming he was busy with work and traveling frequently to meet potential investors. When he was home, his behavior was erratic, disappearing for hours, sometimes all night, without explanation, and his mood swings were unpredictable and intense. He was no longer the attentive, caring husband Claire had fallen in love with. Claire had grown accustomed to Daniel's long absences, but she had always believed in his integrity. It wasn't until she found a second cell phone hidden in his study drawer that she started to question everything. When she confronted him about it, he brushed it off, saying it was just an old phone he used for business. But Claire noticed the phone was fully charged, with recent calls and messages. Her suspicion deepened, but she wanted to trust him. She chose to believe his excuses, until that fateful evening in early November. It was a cold, rainy night, and they had just returned from a charity gala where Daniel had been his usual charming self, shaking hands, smiling for photos, and making generous donations. But on the drive home, he seemed distracted, tense, and on edge. When they got home, they had a heated argument about his constant absences. Daniel stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. "I just need some air," he muttered, before disappearing into the night. The next morning, Daniel didn't come back. Claire tried calling him repeatedly, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Hours turned into days, and still, there was no sign of Daniel. Claire was frantic, contacting his friends, his colleagues, and even the local hospitals, but no one had seen or heard from him. She filed a missing persons report with the Millfield Police Department, and a search began. The local news picked up the story, portraying Daniel as a successful businessman who had mysteriously vanished. A week later, Claire received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was cold and detached. "Mrs. Foster, this is Officer Morgan from the State Highway Patrol. I'm afraid I have some bad news. Your husband's car was found at the bottom of Cedar Cliffs. It appears to have gone off the road in the heavy rain last week. The vehicle is badly damaged, and we believe there are no survivors." Claire's world crumbled in an instant. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone. She couldn't breathe. The police informed her that due to the terrain and the condition of the vehicle, it would take time to recover the body, but they assured her they were doing everything they could. Claire was devastated, her grief consuming her every thought. The love of her life, her partner, was gone, just like that. But even in her deepest sorrow, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered that something didn't add up. Daniel had been an experienced driver, especially on those winding mountain roads, and why had his car been found miles away from where he was supposedly heading that night? The more she thought about it, the more the details seemed off. The police explained the circumstances as an accident: the rain, the dark, the treacherous roads. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Driven by a growing suspicion, Claire decided to look deeper into Daniel's life. She started with his office at home. She spent days going through his papers, emails, and financial records. She discovered that Daniel had recently withdrawn large sums of money from their joint account, amounts that made no sense given their regular expenses. Claire also found a series of emails between Daniel and an unknown person discussing offshore accounts, transfers, and a safe exit plan. Her heart pounded as she read the words, and her confusion turned into a cold, hard realization. Daniel was planning something big, something that went far beyond their marital troubles. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire hired a private investigator, a retired detective named James Harrington. James had a reputation for being thorough and relentless, with a knack for tracking down people who didn't want to be found. When Claire showed him the emails and financial records, he agreed to take the case. "This looks like someone who is preparing to disappear," he said. "Your husband may have staged his own death." Over the next few weeks, James and Claire worked tirelessly, piecing together Daniel's movements before his disappearance. James discovered that Daniel had booked a flight from a small private airstrip just hours before the crash was reported. The flight was to the Cayman Islands, a well-known haven for those looking to hide assets and avoid detection. Claire was stunned but not surprised. She knew Daniel was ambitious, but she never imagined he would go to such lengths. James also found that Daniel had rented a small beach house in the Caymans under an alias, David Palmer. It seemed that Daniel had meticulously planned his escape, from the staged accident to his new identity, and had already moved a significant amount of money to offshore accounts. But Daniel had underestimated Claire. She was no longer the trusting, naive wife who believed in his every word. She was a woman on a mission, and she was determined to find him and make him pay for his deception. Claire and James flew to the Cayman Islands, tracking down the beach house Daniel had rented. They staked out the property for days, and on the third day, they saw him, Daniel, alive and well, laughing with a young woman on the porch. Claire's heart raced as she watched from a distance, feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and relief. She was right. He was alive. She wanted to confront him immediately, but James advised caution. "We need to gather evidence first," he said. "We need to prove he's been committing fraud, not just running away." They continued to observe Daniel, documenting his activities. They followed him to meetings with shady-looking men in suits, saw him transfer large amounts of cash, and watched him charm his way through a world that was entirely different from the one he had left behind. It was clear that Daniel had built a new life, a life financed by stolen money and lies. After a week of surveillance, they had enough evidence to expose Daniel. Claire, with a hidden camera, approached the house and knocked on the door. When Daniel opened it, his face went white as a sheet. "Claire, what are you doing here?" He stammered, panic flashing in his eyes. "I could ask you the same thing, Daniel. Or should I say, David," Claire replied, her voice cold. She pushed past him into the house, the camera recording every word. "You thought you could just disappear, leave me to think you were dead, and start a new life? Did you really think you'd get away with it?" Daniel tried to charm her, to manipulate her as he always had. "Claire, it's not what you think," he began. "I was in trouble. I had no choice." But Claire was done listening to his lies. "No choice? You had every choice, Daniel. You chose to betray me, to deceive everyone, to steal millions from innocent people. But now, I'm making a choice. I'm going to make sure you face justice for everything you've done." Within hours, the footage was sent to both the local authorities and major news outlets. Daniel's face was plastered all over the news, and the Cayman police quickly moved to arrest him. He was extradited back to the U.S., where he faced a slew of charges: fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit multiple financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, and Daniel's smug confidence quickly crumbled in court. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with no chance of parole. Claire, meanwhile, became an unlikely hero. Her story was covered by national media, and she used her newfound platform to advocate for victims of financial fraud and to push for stronger regulations and protections for people affected by scams. She became a public speaker, sharing her journey of betrayal, resilience, and justice. She found a new purpose, helping others navigate their own paths through pain and deceit. Claire moved on with her life, but she was forever changed. She learned that sometimes the people you trust the most can betray you in ways you never imagined. But she also learned that strength comes from within, and even in the darkest times, there is always a way forward. Daniel's story ended in disgrace, but Claire's continued to inspire. She was proof that even the most unexpected twists in life can lead to new beginnings.